Hey, it's the Empire, Judo Boxing Empire, backwards for boxing. Now, man, this mega fight with Roy Jones Jr., man, 4 division world champion, first fighter to go to 154 to heavyweight and win the world title while being undefeated. Roy Jones Jr. and Iron Mike Tyson. The man needs no introductions. The destroyer, the guy who's unhinged, unfiltered, and just wilding out in his prime. Mike Tyson, man, Iron Mike Tyson. They're gonna be fighting soon, and a lot of people are stuck between who's gonna win this fight between Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson. Some people say 50-50. Some people hedge more toward Tyson just because he's the heavier fighter. And I've been rocking Roy Jones Jr. just because the man, his highlight reel is so spectacular, and he's a living legend. I thought, why not go for the underdog, right? Now, that being said, man, Roy Jones Jr. is starting to have doubts, man. He's starting to doubt himself, and one thing that I always assumed is Roy Jones Jr. is gonna think he's Roy Jones Jr. and nobody can touch him. But as this fight closes in with Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson fighting each other, Roy Jones Jr. starts to he starts to realize what he did. Now, Roy Jones Jr. and he says, and I quote, "I made a big mistake agreeing to fight Mike Tyson." That's what he said, man. He said he made a big mistake. Now, I'm going to get into some quotes for you. This is Roy Jones Jr., and I quote, "He's still Mike Tyson. He's one of the strongest, most explosive people who ever touched the boxing ring. If anything, I made a mistake going in with him. He's the bigger guy. He's the explosive guy. When it comes to fight, we're going to have to fight. When it comes to bite, we're going to have to bite. Whenever it has to be, it's going to happen. That's just what it is." Now, Roy Jones Jr. talks about how big and strong Mike Tyson is and how many first-round knockouts he got. And, it got to the point where Roy Jones Jr. was talking about things that had nothing to do with boxing. He was talking about, yeah, man, this guy, if biting happens, we're gonna have to bite each other. This is above boxing. This is more than boxing for Roy Jones Jr. because he knows the animosity and a sheer just destruction that Mike Tyson can bring to the ring, because Mike Tyson's not seeing this as an expedition fight at all. He does not see his fight as an expedition fight. He says his fight is a way to redeem himself from his career, because his last 3 or 4 fights before he retired, he got stopped, right? It was 3 or 4 fights, right? He got stopped, and he wants to redeem himself. And not only that, he's not just trying to get one fight in. If he gets past Roy Jones Jr., he's talking about fighting the best and recapturing the peak of the sport, the Mount Everest of the sport. And what's the Mount Everest of the sport? Those titles, right? He wants everyone. He wants the Deontay Wilders. He wants the Anthony Joshuas. He wants the Tyson Furies. He wants everyone to prove that he was the best in his time, but he let his mind wander, and he wants to prove it by doing it in this era. And this is what Mike Tyson is going to do when he thinks of beating Roy Jones Jr. He's trying to beat Roy Jones Jr. in spectacular fashion, man. And Roy Jones Jr., he talked all that trash, but as time gets closer and the fights get closer, reality is sinking in Roy Jones Jr. And he doesn't know if he knows he did made a grave mistake. He made a grave mistake. A lot of people think that Roy Jones Jr. should have retired after he beat the heavyweight champion of the world from 154 to heavyweight. He would have been a GOAT for sure, no doubt about it. But that's why they have sayings like pound for pound. That means if everything was the same, if Roy Jones Jr. was just as big as Mike Tyson, then this fight would be skill for skill. Roy Jones Jr. can handle it. But the fact of the matter is, Mike Tyson's always been a natural heavyweight. Even when he was a little kid, man, when he was 15, 14 years old, he was built like a grown man. He was in the amateurs, stopping grown men. Mike Tyson definitely is a natural heavyweight, and Roy Jones Jr. is not a natural heavyweight. He may have gotten big over the years, but his body is naturally built for heavyweight competition. So he knows that innately Mike Tyson is going to be hitting harder just because he's always been that kind of guy. He has that build. When you look at Mike Tyson, he looks like a linebacker. He has broad shoulders. He's short. He's compact. The guy is built for destruction. you know. So we're gonna see how this whole thing plays out, man. You know, I still want to believe in Roy Jones Jr. The guy got to believe in himself. Him doubting himself, you know, months before the fight, 2 months before the fight, or less than 2 months before the fight, has got me doubting him as well. But I'm still gonna rock with my boy Roy because it's Roy Jones Jr., man. You gotta respect the guy. So hopefully this fear makes him fight better. There's been a lot of fighters who are afraid of the guys they're fighting, but then that's one of the best fights of their career, right? Daniel Jacobs, when he fight Triple G, he talked about he was scared of Triple G, but that was one of Daniel Jacobs' best performances by far, you know. And I thought he beat Triple G when he fought him the first time, you know. So you know, there's a lot of things that fear can make a man do. It can make or break a man. We're gonna see. This is probably the first time in Roy Jones Jr. career when he's really afraid of somebody. I never heard him talk like this before. So hopefully, this really brings out the best in Roy Jones Jr. Now, understand that Roy Jones Jr. is training with young, athletic fighters like Chris Eubank Jr., and that inspired him as well, shockingly. Now, I'm gonna get some close for you guys. This is Roy Jones Jr. training with Chris Eubank Jr. for Mike Tyson, right? And he says, and I quote, "Man, with training with guys like Chris Eubank Jr., they inspired me to get my mind going," said Jones Jr. "They are so good already, but you've got to take their mind to another level. You got to take them somewhere they haven't been yet, or I can't really train them. When they do it, they also awaken me. Things I forgot, things I don't know anymore. It turns me back to a better fighter. It made me remember things that I did once upon a time." So that's where Jones Jr. is saying that, you know, he's teaching Chris Eubank things that he once did, but he stopped doing it because he didn't see a hunger in a young fighter like Chris Eubank Jr. in such a long time. But now that he's training a prodigy like Chris Eubank Jr., you know, it's giving him flashbacks of his own greatness. So this is a big deal, man. You know, Chris Eubank Jr. is an extremely athletic fighter, just like Roy Jones Jr., just in their own ways. I think Roy Jones Jr. was definitely more coordinated than Chris Eubank Jr., but this has parallels, you know. They're both special in their own way. But Chris Eubank Jr. definitely inspired Roy Jones Jr. to maybe get a little more hungry as far as training goes, and to have not such of a lackadaisical style. Roy Jones Jr. has a bad habit of being so athletic, he keeps his hands down. Hopefully, you know, he just does the basics well, and by teaching Chris Eubank Jr. the basics, he's going back to his own fundamentals. You know, that's what he was talking about when he was talking about doing things he used to do, but he forgot. But since he was training someone again from the ground up, maybe he started picking up those old habits he used to do, but stopped doing it because he got to such a level and he was so coordinated and he was so athletic, he sort of skipped those things because he can get away with it because of his speed, right? But anyway, man, let me know how you guys feel about Roy Jones Jr., man. You know, took some inspiration from Chris Eubank Jr., starting to really doubt this whole Mike Tyson thing, but the fight's gonna happen anyway. And it's wild, it's wild stuff, man. Let me know how you guys feel about it, though. Like, comment, subscribe. This is the Empire, Geobasket Empire. Peace.